Historically, the Labor movement, the progressive movement, had a clear sense of power and power relationships and the power interests that they were up against when they wanted to achieve social change. I don't know whether it's the consequence of the baby boomer generation of political leaders being led by many people who themselves had to fight the kind of an extreme left, a militant left, in their way up, their elevation to political leadership. But it strikes me with people like, with Tony Blair, with Barack Obama, they're quite interesting people because you listen to Tony Blair's recent biography and he seems to have a stronger sense of self-definition from the way he fought internal battles within the Labor Party through his younger years than he does from his definition as a progressive leader confronting conservatives. Now that might be an overstatement, but it strikes me that the generation of baby boomer leaders who came through internal fights ended up having a stronger view of themselves fighting the kind of traditional class analysis, the stronger kind of left perspective. And as a result, they wanted to reject all of that kind of way of seeing the world, the sort of class interests, the class warfare. And as a result, they missed a really fundamental thing about achieving reform, which is that reform is really difficult. And it's difficult because power is very unevenly distributed within society. The progressive project is surely about evening the distribution of power in society, not just resources, not just money, but also power. When we confront difficult reform challenges that we try to implement, inevitably we're dealing with that fundamental imbalance of power. And I think that means that you have to approach the challenges of reform in a pretty careful, sophisticated way. A classic example of that, I think, for us in the past term was the mining tax, where we were taking on the largest financial interest in our economy, and yet it was done without that sense of the size, the dimension of the challenge that would be taken on because of the immense financial power that industry has. If you don't have that understanding, that progressive understanding that there are very significant centres of power within a society, then I think you've become quite naive about the process of implementing change, and you're not going to be effective in achieving change. The interesting thing about community organising we spoke about this morning is that community organising essentially comes out of that analysis, even though you can think of it as in terms of a lot of small granular meetings at ground level that are connecting with people's day-to-day concerns. You read the fundamental thinking behind it, Saul Alinsky, who says all politics is about power and organising is about telling people that they have the power to change. That's the whole philosophy behind it. Mike Geekan, the guy who succeeded Alinsky as one of the leaders of the community organising movement the last 40 years in the United States, says exactly the same thing. It's all about empowering people. This is what community organising is. It starts from the ground up and it builds people's sense of confidence that they can achieve change. That's at the heart of being able to advance the progressive project, and yet I think that it's often not factored into the way in which we approach reform and try to achieve change. And as a result, we end up with talking about things which are fundamentally significant to the country's future and to people's lives, but we talk about them in the most technocratic, robotic, managerial sort of way, rather than capturing the heart of the change process, which is about challenging powerful interests in order to achieve change. So a second perspective, and it's a historical perspective from our own Labor history, progressive history, is that the power analysis that we've had in the past is actually still incredibly relevant for the future. And it would actually help, it would assist us in understanding where we've failed in the last few years and some of the things that we've tried to implement if we have that analysis. And I think that takes us into thinking about not just party renewal, but the progressive infrastructure we need in a country like Australia, that we need to go beyond thinking about simply the organisation of the Labor Party to thinking of the large picture of progressive media, progressive think tanks, advocacy organisations, our collaboration with the non-government organisations outside of ourselves, the sort of process that has been going on in the United States during the last 10 years or so, which goes beyond party renewal to a larger picture of seeing that when you're engaged in a very challenging power relationship and trying to take on powerful interests, you need to build as much power into your movement and not rely just on a political party. I'd suggest that that's particularly important in a time when obviously political leaders are very discredited and political parties are very discredited, that you need to have a larger picture of a movement. Last point is just to pick up on some of the work that has been done recently around Australia's national identity and the stories that we can tell ourselves that can give ourselves a hope for our own future. The interesting story of Australia that you know is not well understood by most people, even in our own movement, is the extent to which 100 years ago, 80 years ago, Australia was one of the most progressive countries in the world, that we achieved so much for working people early on in our time. And it in fact goes beyond that period of the sort of 1890 to 1914 period, Australia as a social laboratory, but even going back to the mid-19th century. It's stark to see how in that early period, the second half of the 19th century, as we had parliaments, as the nascent democratic movement in Australia was growing, that Australians defined themselves as democrats, which was actually a very explicit statement that differentiated themselves from the British. The British talked about themselves as a free nation, as a constitutional nation. Democracy wasn't part of the British story. In fact, they saw democracy as something that was dangerous and would result in the rule of the mob. That's what the French were like, that's what the Americans were like. And hence, for example, it wasn't until 1918 when universal suffrage was opened up in Britain, or some way there, where women were actually given the right to vote, where women over 30 were given the right to vote, and working men were. And the electorate goes from 8 million to 21 million in Britain in 1918. So Australia is well ahead of that, but it's part of our identity right from the beginning that we see ourselves as a democratic nation, and we see ourselves as a progressive nation, and we give things like the award system that we established, the minimum wages, workers' compensation, a whole range of social protections that are established in Australia ahead of the world, and of course we're the first country to elect a majority Labor government. So there are significant parts of our own story that can help us define Australia for the future. Australia, in our best moments, we achieved these things. So too, what are the challenges that we face now as we look to the future? Using our own history, our own story, our national identity as a way in which to open up what we can be in the future. That were a set of choices that were made in those times, a set of choices that we need to make for the future as well. They're just three examples around worldview and our narrative, around understanding power, around our national identity story, where looking backwards to our own history can actually give us some inspiration, some fresh insights, and can help us to build out this story that we have as the progressives in Australia. I'd now like to open up to Nick Dyrenfurth.